What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the latest adaptation of an incredibly popular story, and that is The Color Purple. Directed by Blitz Bazawule, this film stars people like Fantasia Barrino, Taraji P. Henson, Danielle Brooks, Colman Domingo, Corey Hawkins, Halle Bailey, and so many more. So ahead of the release of this film, I was actually hoping to go back and check out 1985 Steven Spielberg's version of The Color Purple, which of course was based on the 1982 book by Alice Walker. I didn't end up getting around to doing that, but I'm almost glad I didn't, because one thing I could say about that movie is while I do remember it being incredibly emotional and being a very heavy watch, I can't necessarily say I remember all the details and all the characters and all the things that happen outside of some pretty big key plot points throughout the course of the film. So going into this movie, it was a bit of a new experience, and one of the things people always want out of a remake is it for it to kind of be different. You know, why make a remake? A lot of times people will say if it isn't different than the original. And in the case of this one, similar to the Broadway production that started in the mid 2000s, it is a musical instead of the more dramatic approach that the original film that Steven Spielberg had. Now, that original film is without a doubt an incredible film. From what I remember it being incredibly emotional, being incredibly heavy to watch at times, and oftentimes being incredibly gripping. And when that stage play ended up coming into the mix in the 2000s, I know that Fantasia, who actually is the lead in this film, actually played the main character for about a year or so on that stage play. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting that here, all these years later, we're getting a new iteration of The Color Purple, with Fantasia returning to play the character in the role, again being it a musical, this time in a film. And so if you're not familiar with what The Color Purple is all about, I'm not going to spoil the movie here, even though it is a story that a lot of people do know, at least the basic gist of. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the movie's about without getting too deep into spoilers. The movie specifically hones in on the character of Celie, played by Fantasia, who I'm very happy to see in this film, as I haven't seen her in something in quite some time, and I was always a fan of her from the early American Idol days to some of the stuff that she would end up doing in the years after that. And so the movie really focuses on Celie, this young woman who at a very young age is unfortunately married to some guy just because her dad kind of wants to get rid of her in a way and kind of wants to make a profit off of her in a way. And she marries into this family where the husband does not love her. He just forces her to cook, clean, and ultimately, just without getting into spoilers, the rest of the movie is her dealing with tons of hardships in a loveless home, and over the course of the film she starts to find new hope, a new fight in herself, some newfound strength and resilience through a group of women that she ends up building a bit of a sisterhood with. And over the course of the film she kind of starts to regain who she is and starts to actually build who she is on her own without the oppression of a loveless home. And I won't get too much deeper into it. There's tons of tragedy and sadness and prejudice that takes place over the course of this film that is incredibly hard to watch, and that's one thing I definitely remember about that original film. Now, I mentioned this film is a musical, so I think that at times it does lean away from some of the drama to give us more of a musical vibe to it. And on one hand, I do think it was really interesting. I do think this is an incredibly well-made film, and the musical numbers are incredibly well put together. But there was at times a feeling of it feeling like a stage show that just so happens to be filmed on sets and locations that you'd see in a movie. Oftentimes, for me at least, taking away from some of the emotion and some of the drama of certain moments to give us a musical number that sometimes would still convey that emotion and that drama, but just maybe not as much as I would have felt it had it just been a played out normal dramatic scene. Now, with all of that said though, one thing that I can absolutely say with zero reservations is that this is an absolutely incredibly well made film. Whether it be the absolutely gripping performances that kept me absolutely glued to the screen from the beginning to the end of the movie, or the costume design, the set design, the locations used, the cinematography, the choreography, the vocal performances, whatever the case may be, when it comes down to the technical elements of this film, it's practically perfect. The movie looks, sounds, and is acted pretty much perfectly, and when it comes down to all of the talent on camera and behind the camera to make a lot of these scenes work, you can definitely tell a lot of talent went into this, a lot of hard work went into this, and massive kudos to all of the talented people who helped make this movie a reality. With that said though, we are going to get into my personal thoughts on the film when it comes down to pacing and the screenplay, but without a doubt I just had to say I absolutely thought this film was incredibly well made, with the key thing in this film that kept me absolutely glued to the screen being the performances. Fantasia is incredible in this film as our lead character, Celie. Really thoroughly enjoyed her throughout the course of the runtime. Again, like I mentioned before, I feel like I haven't seen Fantasia in a lot of things recently. I haven't really even kept up with her on social media. So to see her in something after all this time, as somebody who was a pretty big fan of hers back in the day, it was really awesome to see. I thought that she absolutely crushed it as this character, and it made me interested to go back and maybe even watch some footage of her playing this character on stage all those years ago. Outside of her, you have Taraji P. Henson playing Suge Avery, who is this popular singer who's, comes across Celie and builds this bond with her, somebody that doesn't really ever feel like she's looked at or cared for, is now being cared for by this person that's kind of revered by so many people around her. And then you have people like Danielle Brooks in the film, who also builds a bond with Celie over the course of the film. And then you have Colman Domingo in here, who plays this, abusive, not so great, loving husband who goes by the name Mr., who Celie has to deal with over the course of the film. I just recently saw Colman Domingo in Rustin, where he was absolutely fantastic. And even though he is incredibly and frustrating in this movie, he was incredible in this film as well. And I think that's just one of the biggest praises I have to give this film, is that the cast is so good. Nobody's giving a weak performance. Nobody's ever feels like they're kind of phoning it in. Never feels like anything is ever shoehorned when it comes to the performances. It feels like everybody knows who their characters are, that everybody is absolutely living in those characters while the cameras are rolling. And it was without a doubt the thing that kept me glued to the screen the most. For whatever gripes I may have had when it came down to the pacing of this film and some of the songs and some of the dramatic moments, I can ultimately say that anything that was ever a negative for me never really had to do with the performances that were displayed on screen. There were even times where I thought to myself, well, I'm not crazy about this musical number, or I'm not crazy about the way that that scene played out, or I even maybe am finding myself feeling a little bit bored. But even amidst feeling those feelings while watching the film, I was ultimately still always incredibly impressed by the amount of commitment that was coming from these actors on screen, which ultimately kept me completely glued to the screen and kept me wanting to see where this movie was going to go. Even though I knew the general premise, I knew where it was headed, I knew what that original story was, I was, still intrigued and to see what this iteration was going to do, simply because these performances were top tier, with Fantasia at the center being the absolute star of this film, but everybody having incredible moments to shine. Now, I just mentioned that I loved all of those technical elements, but I mentioned a little bit about the pacing. And so if there was anything I had to say I had gripes with this movie, was the pacing, was the overall flow of the movie. It's a movie that felt like a stage play in a lot of ways. It felt like a stage musical, and it's a movie that's being filmed like a normal film, but at times the way certain moments were staged and the way that certain songs played out felt like the movie wanted me to feel more emotional for scenes in a way that almost would have probably felt like it worked better on stage than it did in a movie. That's not to say that there weren't moments in those musical numbers that actually made me feel something or had a smile on my face. I was constantly impressed or intrigued by where the songs were going, and there were a number of songs that I actually found to be pretty catchy and fun to listen to, but I can genuinely say after having seen it that there's none that I'm clamoring to really re-listen to. And a lot of times I did feel like there were some emotional moments that I just wanted to see play out between the two actors and play out between the two characters that would turn into a musical number that oftentimes felt like it kind of detracted from some of those impactful moments. Again, it's not to say that those moments in that singing and those musical numbers weren't good, but just simply that I felt like sometimes the impact of some certain emotional moments just didn't hit as heavy for me, simply because of the fact that now we're moving into a musical number that's going to either have dancing or not have dancing, and it's just going to kind of, at a certain point, start to feel a lot the same, very samey at certain moments. The Color Purple is a powerful and emotional story that I think has a lot of things that work about it. But when it comes down to this one, it's not one I'm necessarily clamoring to revisit, but I was undoubtedly incredibly impressed by all of the great filmmaking that went into this film. There was some top tier performances, as I mentioned before, and it's certainly a film I recommend. It's one of those movies that for me, I can say, I really thought it was cool. I thought it was very well made. I'm not clamoring to revisit it, but I do think it's one of the very best well-made, like maybe musicals of the year. But I can also see that there's going to be a section of people that maybe absolutely love this film and maybe it's their favorite movie of the year, while I can also see that there's going to be a section of people who maybe find it to be okay or a little bit boring. But at the end of the day, I highly recommend The Color Purple. I think if you're somebody who's interested in this film, if it looks like something that's up your alley, definitely give it a watch. I don't necessarily know that it's going to work for everybody. I don't know that everybody's going to love this film, but I think there's a lot of good on display here. I just wish that I had felt a little bit more connection to certain story beats, to certain characters. I wish that the pacing had worked a little bit more for me, and I wish that the story felt like it flowed a little bit better. But there's a lot of great setup and conclusion to a lot of things that this movie sets up. There's some great performances, some fun musical numbers, and I think it's definitely worth your time at the theater this year. So have you seen The Color Purple? Is that what brought you to this review? Are you planning to go see The Color Purple? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.